really excited to have Jeff Jackson here from Algonquin College. Jeff presented around this time last year a really popular webinar and presentation he's been doing all over the world about training to failure. If you haven't seen that, I highly recommend going to aee.org/webinars and checking it out. And today, Jeff is bringing a little bit more of a global view to sort of your outdoor education operation. How are your internal systems, management kind of structures, staff culture, how does that influence accidents, incidents, and how you manage them? So Jeff, really excited to have you here today. You always really open my mind a little bit with the material you provide. So I'm gonna go ahead and pass it on over to you and we can get started.
Great, thanks Dan. Welcome everybody. Here I am sitting in my office in Algonquin College, which is in Ontario, Canada. So whenever you look on a map here, you can see where I'm somewhere near the never-ending highway in central eastern Ontario, right beside Algonquin Park. There's only a handful of you folks online here today listening in, and that's totally fine. In some ways, that's really beneficial, and you should take it upon yourself to ask questions as we roll along. I talk kind of fast, and I'll consciously try to keep it in check, but feel free to just interject questions at any time to either spend more time on something, to apply an idea to something that you're working on, interaction, whatever it takes to make that work. So I come from a field-based perspective. However, my more recent work has been involved, whether it's academic research, consulting work, from a PhD standpoint, has been around safety culture, organizing ourselves for safety, and the factors influencing all of those pieces of safety. That's really what I spend my time on now. So that's what we're doing. Excuse me, just one moment here. My PowerPoint keeps clicking off. Good. You see this cover. There's a textbook I've put out, and across Canada, most of the colleges have adopted this textbook. It's really the only real resource available for talking about a management level perspective on putting safety into our operations. Much of our field, our outdoor adventure, our experiential education, our outdoor education field, the safety world is focused on frontline instructor training, frontline instructor decision making, frontline instructor skills building. Today I'm going to talk about the organization and what we do as managers. More importantly, this is anchoring ourselves to a bigger field around systems risk management, and that's the hot topic that folks are talking about, and that's what today is about. It's getting beyond the operator, getting beyond the instructor, and looking at what we do. I'm draping this in a perspective of an event, looking at an event, but regardless, this is about system interaction. That's the bottom line, and that's what we're going to pull out here. So we're going to start with talking about the operators and what that means, and then we're going to kind of pull it apart and go bigger and macro, and it'll land on our desk as a manager, what we're looking at. So bottom line, it's easy to blame the operator. It's easy to blame the instructor when something goes wrong. Don't do it, because quite frankly, we may have something to do with that as well. How do we set up our staff to do things right, and how do we set it up so that maybe sometimes we help them fail at the same time? Sense making is not decision making. I'll do a short detour on here because that sets the systems conversation for us, and that's where we're spending most of our time today. So like I said, feel free to ask questions as we go along. You can interject, and I can spend more time on something if that's what makes more sense. So operator error. If you put this on your radar and you see any event come through the media, whether it's a train crash, a commuter bus crash, something bigger, something smaller, read the media, and it always blames the guide, the driver, the pilot. It's such an easy thing to do, and there's some reasons that it comes that way, but once you start looking, you will always see that the quick, fast version is just to blame the person who's in charge. Manganapopo in 2008, that was a story in New Zealand where there was a flash flood, which in a canyoneering situation, which killed 6 students and a teacher. The fallout from that, just pulled from the newspaper, blaming the staff, right? The staff were not qualified enough, and take any event, and we can find situations where people blame the guide or the instructor. More recently, just last month in Japan, we saw an avalanche kill 7 kids in a high school program and a teacher. The news is just slowly kind of building, the analysis is just slowly building, but watch that analysis as it unfolds for blaming the instructor. It's going to happen. My question is, What can we do as managers to look at, to shine the light on ourselves and ask, what do we do? And what are we setting up so that we're creating safety and we're stacking the odds in favor of positive instead of negatives. So beyond the specific, start to draw bigger here. This world around operator error is actively being talked about in industrial safety world. So something like somebody like Charles Perrow, the second quote here, there's continual operator error. And that's a reality. And in the outdoor field, it's no different. People make mistakes all the time. Some of them create bigger issues. Some of them are completely benign and are corrected and are carried on. The question is, what are the systems that we can put in place to ensure that those little errors don't stack up and become something bigger? So we're going to build that. We're going to get to that point. So why do we blame the guide? This paradigm, environment, and human element and how they interact, objective hazards interacting with subjective hazards, I dislike this immensely. It's still floating around. It's been around a long time, but we've moved beyond this. But the interaction, there needs to be some, well, if these are Venn diagrams, some overlapping here. So it implies that the human did something wrong, right? The environment's not moving. The environment didn't do anything different. So there must be a human element here. The unsafe act, even the word we use, the unsafe act, implies that a mistake was made. So there's a paradigm that our adventure world uses, and it's quite frankly, it's outdated. We need something better, and systems are a better way to look at this. So why do we blame the guide? Our evolution in our field has gone from safety planning in the early days to liability planning and liability management, to beyond that to looking at hazard-based safety or a trigger-based approach, if-then kind of situation. So if you hear thunder, then this is what you do. Those all rely upon the operator to do things properly. So if you get this if-then trigger-based approach, you end up with a pretty robust belay system, if we use this analogy, but you end up with an anchor that's super complicated. You have these policies and procedures and all of these details that really are beyond any one person to try to remember, let alone implement. So that becomes cumbersome in itself. So there's real limitations to draping all of this on our staff to say, if then trigger-based approach. Why else do we blame the guide? There's just some basic psychological conditions. We're predisposed as humans, unfortunately, to see things at an individual level than to see things at a macro level. Things like hindsight bias, that's a retrospective view where we see things. That's the hindsight is 20/20. That's called a hindsight bias. And there's studies around this, is how natural it is for humans to look back and see things that we wouldn't have been able to see at the time. Attribution error, we like to blame people. We have a hard time with the ambiguities of a situation, but a person's very concrete. We blame those folks, or we rely upon those folks instead. Confirmation bias, we often see what we want to see, especially in an emotion-charged situation. All of these things lead us to blame the operator, just something we need to get beyond. So jump back on your keyboards. Tell me what you see here in this photo. And Dan's going to put up a poll. This is one of the most famous psychology images. So when you look at this image, what do you see? So you're likely, and you can let us know through the poll, you're likely going to see a young woman, or you're going to see an old lady. Some people can see both. You'll likely see one or the other. So take this short opportunity to do that. This is an example, and psychology spends a lot of time thinking about this, is how we can take the same set of cues. In this case, it's an image, but it could be something as complex as an event as it unfolds, and we can see it in completely different ways. We can take that information and collect it and see one situation or another, see an old lady or see a young woman. Dan, did we get folks to tell us what they saw in this image?
Yeah, split to part 25% old lady, 25% young woman, and 50% both.
All right, that's great. And you know, I find this kind of exercise fascinating because it's tied to sense making and a bunch of other fields that I spend my time thinking about. But it's how do we take this information and assemble it? So that's the position that's where we start, from the position of the guide. Let me pull in a little bit of the theory and a little bit of what people are writing about in this world. Human fallibility, like gravity and weather or terrain, is just another foreseeable hazard. We're going to make mistakes. We start from that position. The issue then is not why did that person make a mistake, but how is it that it failed to be corrected, either at the time by themselves or based on our safety systems that we have in the background. And James Reason is one of the granddaddies in this field. We're going to introduce you to two here today. James Reason is the first of the two. And he was the first to put on our agenda an idea about what we need from an organizational systems to protect these errors and anticipate that these errors are going to happen. So we move then from our hazard-based approach to a systems-based approach. And that's the point of today's talk, is to anchor our adventure, our outdoor education, and our experiential education world with the greater systems-based approach that's happening. And if you just go on Google Scholar and do a little bit of digging around, you're going to find lots of interesting reading, none of it specific from our adventure field, but all of it completely relevant for how we manage complex operations. Then we're a complex system because of the environments that we interact with. So what do we have here? This is Rasmussen, second of the big thinkers in this field. So Jens Rasmussen, 1997, came up with this idea around socio-technical systems. Our outdoor adventure field has dealt primarily with the bottom end of this, staff and work. So how we train our staff to interact with the activities that they're leading. And you know what, for the most part, that's still an important piece of the puzzle, especially if you're a younger staff or you have a young staff without a lot of tenure. That's a big focus on what we're doing. What Rasmussen has put together and what people have now wholeheartedly embraced is that there's interactions on all levels here. As we go up the ladder, we leave our staff, we talk about managers, and I'm speaking from a manager's position here, hoping you're interpreting the same talk from a management level. We've got our company or organization, which has an influence on management, who has an influence on staff, which has an influence on the work. But even above that, we've got things like our regulations, our accrediting bodies, our certifications, any laws that happen to be in place, whether the land management laws or statutory laws. And then we go into the role of government. And even beyond government, we've got social norms and expectations and beliefs. Here's what we've made some big breakthrough, is to see that all of these things interact, and it's not one thing. There was a brief foray into root cause analysis, but in the industrial sector, that was about 15 years ago, but it got left behind as Rasmussen's systems have taken over, and we get to this bigger idea that, you know what, there's no one thing going wrong. When things go wrong, it's because of several interrelated factors. So as a manager who cares, how can I look at my operations and come up with a test against them? That's what I'm going to talk about and getting what here today is, how can we assess our own internal systems to know if they're doing what they're supposed to do? So highlighted in red here, the company level and the management level, that's where we're spending our time. Knowing lots of work is happening underneath this, the staff and the work level, what can we do at a management level and a company level to assess our systems? So I'm talking about internal systems. There is other good work out there about the whole socio-technical ladder and all of those things. Primarily out of Australia. That's where folks are really doing some good thinking about that, and we're gonna see that on our plates in just the near future here. So internal systems. If anybody's ever had the fortune or misfortune of sitting through a presentation with me, you always see this diagram. This really organizes my whole universe to me. The 7 systems that organize our activities. So we have our program activities in the middle. All of the pieces of our risk management processes and procedures fit into one of these 7 systems. And whenever we think of it that way, rather than a complicated belay anchor, it's in fact just organized around 7 different factors. Each of these 7 different systems have their own processes to ensure that they work. This is where we start. And I don't want to go into all of these things. This is what the kind of the textbook world can support that. I want to talk about testing these things that they work. So I'm talking about internal systems to make all of these things happen. So, little transition photo. Hopefully, it's one of my favorite of all of the images that I carry around with me. So, I regularly use this one. It's a good analogy for what we're doing. So, as we move from looking at the individual instructor, we move towards systems and how that works. Now, I'm going to just set up about the different perspectives on error, so we can talk about an event-based model using our systems themselves. So, understanding errors. Here's where James Reason, one of those 2 names, coined these two terms and has really helped us understand the difference between active errors, which is what our guides do, which is what our instructors do, and that's called the sharp end. That's what happens in the field. Real-time decisions that are made, active errors. That's the focus of our traditional staff training and the trigger-based model, if-then kind of decision-making for folks. And it's real, but what we need to understand is our guides act within a bigger organizational context. So those are the latent errors. Latent meaning slow, behind the scene, dormant is a really good word out of that. Things that lie idle until they become an issue. Rather than the sharp end, the active end, this is the blunt end. These are not active errors. These are just gaps in the systems which might always be present, potentially are present, and maybe are not an issue only in certain circumstances which we haven't even experienced yet. Latent errors. And that's what the focus of systems-based risk management is all about, because as managers, this is our problem. Our guides have to deal with active errors. We'll train them to minimize slips, lapses, and mistakes. We're in charge of making sure that our systems are robust and catch them. So human error is a consequence, not a cause. I've got this particular line pinned on a corkboard right behind the monitor that I'm looking at this right now. Every time something comes across my desk, an incident report, for example, where something goes on in the field that required a trip to the hospital, I look at this and say, now how did we set up that student, that staff, that situation? How do we set them up to do this to themselves? Is their behavior a consequence of something I've done and not merely the cause of their actions? Getting beyond that idea about root cause and going towards a bigger idea about how do systems or set this up. So here's the problem with environment and human element and how they interact. The unsafe act idea, the human agent idea, is that all this happens in an organizational context. So it happens within a mission statement. It happens within a commercial venture, a profit and loss kind of situation. It happens within a risk tolerance belief, whether it's written down or not. It happens within a certain program type, certain environment, certain populations. These are all handed to our staff. And it's not just as simple as them interacting with their environment. It's much more complex. There's layers here. I'm focusing today on the layers with the organization, just keeping it simple and making it more specific that way. So we can't change a human condition. People will always make errors. So what can we set up to make errors less likely? Or when errors do inevitably occur, that they aren't fatal errors or even serious errors, what can we put in place to do that? Here's my second favorite photo. See this all the time in my presentations, because really this says as much about the place where these people work as it does about the individual driving that yellow forklift on the bottom. This was not a sole individual decision which led to this. This is a bigger cultural situation which we're observing here. And that's what systems thinking allows us to see, to step back and see how we set folks up and what can we put in place to do this. So the rest of the time here, I'm going to spend potentially a half an hour talking through the pieces of this system-based event model. And again, please ask questions as we go along in here. I'll keep an eye on the questions as they come in, and I can spend a little more time on them. So really, what I'm going to offer is a checklist of points to examine. And the title of this is based around event investigation, but you know what? You could pull this out today and go at it and ask yourself these questions. More likely get a bunch of your senior staff or your managers together to pick through these things and ask yourself where you see holes in your system. So this is an organized means of putting systems into place so that they mean something. So yeah, hopefully by the time we get through all this, it'll be practical enough that you can see how you can apply this to what you really do. So if this is a pyramid, we've got our organization on the bottom, latent factors, the conditions of this is how our company is set up, this is the operation we run. That then creates the social the middle section, which is all the social interactions, how teams get along, who's in charge, how groups contribute to producing the trips that you're producing. And then at the top, the pointy end, the sharp end, as Reason would say, that's the active errors, the individuals and how they made sense of a situation and contributed to those. Each of these, quite frankly, is their own story. I'm going to focus our time on the bottom end of this. Need to preface a little bit how we get there. So active errors. The big change, I think, that we've managed in our outdoor field in the last 10 years is to incorporate sense making. How do people make sense of a situation? This is anchored by a gentleman named Weick, Carl Weick. You can see his one of his key ideas here. Rather than bad people making poor decisions, which is the operator error model. Why did that person make a mistake? Instead, we say that person was trying as hard as they could, and somehow it didn't work out. What did they perceive that I'm somehow missing? So that's what sense making does, and there's a lot of room in the sense making world. My previous presentation here with the AEE webinar series was about sense making and about training to failure. It was primarily about how do we help our staff become more sophisticated in their sense making. That's where it starts. So if we're going to look at an event, we need to understand what happened, but we understand it not from the football commentator chalk talk kind of perspective. We instead try to situate ourselves as the instructor and understand the cues that they were reading and try to recreate the situation as they saw it. That's number one. That's useful for us, and that will become instructive down the road, not the focus of what we're talking about today. So there's number one. Okay, so great. In order to get by number one, there's a really simple test, and it's called the substitution test. This was put together by a gentleman named Johnson way back in late 70s or early 80s, which is the test to say, was this a mistake or is this a systems problem? Now, the true systems theorist would say it's always a system problem every time. Every single mistake is a problem of the situation. I don't necessarily always agree because I like this test, which asks, given how events unfolded and were perceived in real time to the people who were there, is it likely that a new individual would have behaved the same way? So this is the test. So if we dropped a different person into that situation and they would have perceived all the cues and knowing what their training and their beliefs, would they have done the same thing? And if the answer is yes, we have a systems problem here. If the answer is no, as in like, no, this is a totally random event, nobody else would ever do that, well, that's a human error. And that can happen too. So this substitution test is a place to start, and I like this. I'm testing this in my mind pretty regularly, and I'm asking, somebody else dropped in there? Would this have happened to them as well? Substitution test. So what that looks like, we look at the situation, try to understand all the factors as of what happened. We go to the substitution test. No, nobody else would have ever done that. Well, that's operator error. And then we have to ask ourselves, well, is this deliberate? Was somebody trying to hurt themselves? Was somebody trying to sabotage their trip and try to get out of there? That's not unheard of in our field. Or is it a plain slip? Or was it a mistake? We can look at those things. And in fact, the just culture world, the newest safety culture interpretation is now called just culture, as in justice. Just culture, they are doing a really good job of trying to map out this idea about errors and how to categorize and understand different errors. What's the difference between deliberate errors versus slips versus mistakes? And they're in fact doing a great job of taking the next step and said, well, if somebody has a slip, here's what we need to do to remediate that. What kind of training does it take to back that up? Somebody makes a mistake, what kind of training does it make to back that up? Just as an aside, a slip is a good plan, poorly executed. A mistake is a bad plan, properly executed, right? So a slip is somebody had the right idea, they just couldn't follow through physically. A mistake is whenever somebody actually makes a problem. So that's number two, substitution test. Let me give you a specific example of a substitution test. I just had a student, we are doing, so I'm in Canada, spring is just happening now, we're just losing our snow. We had our first year students were out on a winter expedition for the last week and another group the week before that. Lots of groups out in the field at one time, about 4 or 5 groups at a time. A student got a twig in the eye and cut their eye. So substitution test would say that's not a systems error. So this student happened to just be walking off to the side of the trail and got whacked in the eye and it cut their eye. This is not a big deal from an organization standpoint. Because another person in that situation probably would have been a little bit to the left. And quite frankly, we've been doing winter trips here for 17 years and we've never had somebody get a stick in the eye. So that says that was a somewhat of a random event, not unforeseeable, but it's something that's not attached to a system. Now we could look at other situations and we can look at that and say, huh, you know, I could see another person being injured in the same way. Now I need to go back and investigate what I'm doing. So now this becomes a bigger investigation. If we start at the social level, the social factors that are interacting here, this is a whole presentation on its own, and I'll get to this someday, and we'll be able to talk about this on another conversation. But there's things like authority and role definition. Who's in charge? How do people perceive their role against that person in charge? Assumption and expectations and team functions. We're shelving all of that, but that's completely relevant to how people act. It's one of the variables that is going to be at play. We're going to spend our time here on the organizational factors. So the factors that we as managers put in place to build program, and if we do it right, to build safe program. So there's 3 big areas, and I'm going to spend a bit of time on each of these. So number 1 is talking about risk tolerance, talking about organizational factors of system errors, or that's tied to system maps. See that briefly. And then lastly, operating features, which are understood to be higher risk and higher exposure around those. Okay, so we'll spend a bit of time on each of those. So let's see, starting with this one, risk tolerance. So if there's 3 big areas we're going to talk about, this is a foundation piece. Now, as a manager, you and I may or may not be able to do a whole lot around this one, because these decisions were historically built somewhere in our organization's past, and maybe are handed down to us from up high. Risk tolerance is really an explicit understanding of what we will tolerate and what we won't, what exposure is appropriate for us as a company, but also what exposure will we permit for our clients, for our students. And this is inherent in the things that we do. It's built into our programs. So if we're doing whitewater canoeing, that says a certain thing about our comfort for risk, our risk tolerance, as opposed to if we're doing a low ropes course. That's a very different type of exposure level. So it's bundled into what we do. Sometimes our risk tolerance is explicitly stated through mission statements, or potentially even written as a risk tolerance statement. Here's the borders for the activities that we're going to be involved in. I'm wholeheartedly support writing these things down, but it's likely also bundled up in your marketing material, and it's bundled up in your policy manual, and it's bundled up in the pieces of the logistics puzzle that run the trips that you're doing. Explicit risk tolerance. This is what you as a manager would say. And now we have to ask ourselves, what about our implied risk tolerance? Is that really the way it is? And our staff are pretty sophisticated to know that there's the things that they hear the boss say, and then there's really how things work. And we need to understand that there's sometimes misalignment out of this. This is called drift. And there's a whole field of study around drift, the difference between what we believe should be happening and how it actually works. So some things like program planning and exposure. So if we see risk creep as our programs become more remote, potentially longer, potentially offering more risk exposure, potentially migrating into more challenging clientele, without it changing our risk tolerance statement, we see the implication that we're actually okay taking on more risk. My organization seems to be taking on more risk, so that's an implied message. Safety culture. This is another big, robust field of study which looks at, despite what we say, how do we do things around here? These are things like communication and collaborative decision making, and how do folks perceive the safety procedures and safety processes as protecting themselves, and are they a player? Are they receiving those? That's a big world of safety culture. And there's measures around safety culture. We can assess that, and you can find that online, again, through Google Scholar, to look at these variables and see where you can make improvements around those things. There's the things we say, but then there's how our organization works. And lastly, here's the real test, which as a manager, where does my attention go and where am I spending my money? If we talk a lot about the value of our staff and all of the things that go with that, yet we don't have any money for training, well, that's the implied message there is at odds with the explicit message. So where do we put our attention? Where do we put our dollars? We need to put our money where our mouth is what the bottom line of that is. So there's a test. One of these kind of checklists is to say, what actions do I put in place as a manager, which might actually be confusing people about risk tolerance, or giving missed messages at least. Risk tolerance issues as a source of systems errors. Okay, so there's a place to start. Click on here. Okay, second area, we look at the systems themselves. So if we look at the base of where we come from, our mission and our understanding of hazards, our tolerance for those. Number two then is we look at the maps that run our organization. So this would be considered a core process map, and I don't want to delve into this in great detail, but this is about where systems hit the road, is how do we map somebody's path through each of these systems. So a core process is how we deliver our trips. Here's an example. If we start at the top right, we have some kind of a deposit or a payment is received, and then that leads to pre-trip information, some exchange back and forth. We are sharing, let's say, medical information, gear lists. We are getting people's travel arrangements. Depending on where you are, you might be doing a waiver form, some kind of legal release process, which is built into that. There's likely some kind of safety briefing and orientation. Now that we've met folks, we deal with equipment, we get the people out the door, there's logistical elements, the trip itself runs, we bring the trip back, we get their feedback, and we go into a cycle where we hopefully get them back again. Core process map, mapping out all of these touch points along the way. For organizations, I spend time working with organizations, and with managers, mapping out these contact points becomes really insightful, and immediately gaps are seen where the handoffs between one group and another group happens, one staff and another staff happens, for example, or gaps where maybe there's not information transferring from one piece to the next. As a core process map, we look at all these things and say, where can we do this better? If something went wrong along the way, what did that have to do with pre-trip information? What did that have to do with the safety briefing? Potentially an equipment story? Is there logistical elements that fit into this? We can dig into the details on each of these simple points to look at where potentially we see something that could be running better, or potentially that contributed to the story that we're looking at right now, to an event. We're not looking for one cause, it's many things. It could be 100 small things add up here. We don't expect to dig in here and find the smoking gun, the big gaping hole, because we've been likely running our programs for some time and doing it successfully. We're looking for the little pieces which contributed to where we are today, what we're doing. So that's the core process, which lands in the middle of this idea of 7 systems. Each of these systems have their own map, and each of these be mapped out. And I'm going to leave it as far as that today. But within each of those maps, within each of those systems, we can really dig apart all of the control points within our organization and see how they're working. When these 7 systems are organized on a piece of paper and they work as a production tool in our company, they really hit all the moving parts of the system, all the moving parts of the machine. So here's another place to spend some time. And this is a big piece. There's a lot going on here. But as you dig into them and look at each of them, you really end up systematically looking at every little aspect of your organization and testing against whether they are working or not. Okay, another picture just to clear your mind. That's not my kid, for the record, happily. All right, so if we looked at risk tolerance as one of the organizational factors which set up our staff, set them up positively, but we have to ask ourselves, where are we potentially creating confusion or ambiguity? We look at system errors. System errors comes from the perspective of mapping out all of the moving parts of our organizations and looking at their interactions, and then asking ourselves, how can we run those interactions better so that they're going to work? And then lastly, we have operating features. So operating features, for example, I'm going to run a couple by you here. And in some ways, these are just ways to think objectively about our operation so that we can use words to describe them. So the world of industrial safety talks a lot about coupling and complexity as measures. So coupling is how a train analogy really works. Train cars are coupled together. So the question is, how tightly coupled are they? How close together are they? So a loosely coupled system has room between the cars. There's some slack for things to happen. So if you look at the left-hand column, loosely coupled events, there's slack, there's time, there's extra resources, which might be extra people, which might be extra gear. There's options when things go wrong. Things are organized in such a way that they can be corrected. That's a loosely coupled system. There's options at any one particular turn in the road. If we don't like how it works, we just put on the brakes, rethink, and backtrack. That's a loosely coupled system. So as an analogy, we'll call this flat water paddling in a sea kayak or a canoe. A tightly coupled system are things are locked together. So a train that's tightly locked together and it can't become unlocked. There's no slack. There's no spare time. There's no extra people. There's no extra vehicles. There's no extra gear, as in we're running with everything that we've got. There's very few options. So that's a tightly coupled system. Things run faster in a tightly coupled system, and there's less room for error in a tightly coupled system. And that would be a continuous class 5 river. There's just no room to make a mistake. Now that whole gradient between flat water paddling and class 5, there's a spectrum in there. And in fact, some areas we might be tightly coupled, and in others it might be a whole lot looser. My own experience is that often logistics are tightly coupled. Vehicles are allotted per day, and if you don't use your vehicle on that day, somebody else has spoken for it the next day. But once we're in the field, there's often time. The trips themselves don't run that tight that they don't have time to slow down and think about it. So we may have specific aspects of our operations which are tightly coupled, and we need to be careful of those and manage those carefully, because those have pressure on them that other areas don't. So coupling is the first place. Looking at all of our trip and through that core process, that map of the core process that goes step by step by step, and ask, where is the time pressure that we really are rushing through this, and can we afford to loosen that up and put some slack in that system? Slack costs money. I get it. And in my own job here, managing a college program, I know there's parts that are loose, that are tightly coupled, but I don't have any money to change that. But instead, I direct my attention towards it to ensure that those run carefully. Other areas where there is slack in time, then those can run themselves, because there's more options whenever those things are running that way. Coupling. So coupling is one of the pieces of our organization. We have our risk tolerance, we have our core process maps, we have our systems themselves. We've got measures of coupling, and we ask ourselves, when are we putting pressure on our employees because of the coupling? It's too tight. Things are running too close together. Operational consistency. So here's what bigger industrial safety tells us. I don't know of any research, particularly in our outdoor field. There's not a lot of research in our outdoor field, but that looks at operational consistency. So novel events have higher potential of things that go wrong. Novel meaning not normal. The non-normal stuff, that's one of my catchwords. The non-normal events have a higher potential. Things that we're not used to dealing with. Infrequent events have higher potential. What does this mean? This means that on a backpacking trip, the river crossings are the things that we need to worry about. We can walk a lot of miles on a trail and nothing's going to go wrong. Now, the odds, if we look at the hours spent crossing rivers versus hours spent walking down a trail, they're on factors several hundred to 1. Yet it's the river crossings that have the high potential for something to go wrong, as opposed to the walking on the trails. Likewise, if we're crossing a snowfield, likewise, if we are running rapids on a canoe trip, the majority of a canoe trip is spent on flat, smooth water. The rapids become the novel events or the infrequent events, and those are the high potential areas. If we can use that language and turn our field staff's mentality, their sense making that way, which is to recognize when we leave normal and border on non-normal, the infrequent events, they'll view that differently. So operational consistency, if we can run things, if our trips are repeatable and they're milk runs, they leave the non-normal and they become normal, and they're no longer novel and they're no longer infrequent. We get it. So a daily whitewater raft trip where any one guide has potentially run that river 60 or 80 times, what was a novel event now becomes normal, and their competency there grows and the potential goes down significantly. Operational consistency, the more consistencies we can put in place, this becomes a story about routines. So routines as a measure of making sure that our systems run the way we expect them to run. Routines are a way to remove novelty and the infrequent events. And when we break routine, we need to have folks put on a different set of lenses and view the world differently in those particular places. Operational consistency. That probably, I know to field staff, routine sounds terrible, but from a manager standpoint, I want things to be the same every time, more or less. And I like the idea of consistency, and I like when nothing happens. So we need to create a mentality amongst our staff that recognize whenever they're leaving the normal and they're starting to get on the novel events or infrequent events, because there's potential there. And that's what industrial research tells us, is that The things like maintenance, when you shut down the plant to do maintenance, that's whenever things go wrong, is because that's new events that the routines don't necessarily address. Okay, capacity utilization. This is number 6, peak load experience. Whenever things are really busy, that's whenever we see the holes in our system. So this is tied to coupling. Again, we go back to this. So how much slack is there in our system? And as we start to run at full speed, we lose our slack. So this isn't what any one instructor is doing. This is our organization. And whenever we've got all the folks in the field and we have no backup staff and we have no vehicles on standby and we have nothing left, that is an exposure level, because we're basically redlining our speedometer. And if something is to create exposure, we have nothing left to back up that exposure, nothing left to cover it. So capacity utilization on average. Now, as it turns out, companies that are tested at peak load are in fact the safer ones, because they understand the gaps in their system. If you have a system that never ever gets tested, this is why doing emergency response simulations is so valuable. It simulates peak load experience to see where the holes are whenever things are really stressed, or we can at least think through from a risk assessment process, a paper-based risk assessment process, where will we be stressed when it comes to capacity utilization? That's setting up stress in our system that every other piece in the system is going to feel. So coupling says put some slack in there to allow that that we're going to be less than running at full speed. However, we want to have some experience running at full speed, because that's deemed valuable as well. We don't want our clients to take the learning on, though. We can do that from a paper standpoint. And that's going to be one of the takeaways here, is to test our systems through an emergency response simulation, which can be a mental or paper-based exercise. So let's see. What else do we have for the organization? I feel like I'm jumping around here. However, whenever we look at these, they're going to be ticked off in a list, and we're going to just come back and revisit these. Our management model. What kind of management do we put in place? And what does that say about our organization? So as a system, the systems don't tell us what kind of supervision we need. But the question is, are we providing good, clear direction, or are we leaving it up to instructors to do things on their own? And what's the big land in between there? What kind of assumptions are being built into the things that we do that we don't really talk about, but people get? And how do we know that they get it? So what the supervisory models are doing or are not doing. Recognizing that every organization has different understanding because of their operational variables about how supervision is going to work. More supervision is necessary in a lot of cases, and some supervision is impossible. So we have a complex environment because of that tension that's between those two things. We can't go much further than that without spending a whole hour just about talking about supervisory models. This gets a little bit more confusing or more problematic when we look at contracted service providers. What kind of supervision goes in place with this? And I think we've woken up, we as a field have woken up to the benefits of contracted service providers, but the gaps that emerge as soon as we bring them in about supervision and autonomy and how we oversee those providers. That's an organizational structure that's in place, which is setting up a context for people to operate within. Are we doing it right? That's one of the issues we need to be looking at. And then the last one around this about the management models is, as our systems grow, our systems become more complex. And are we putting the management resources in place to check our systems and to make sure that they work? That's what this, potentially this hour is for you, is to be checking those systems mentally for yourself. And come back and say, well, as we grow, I feel like our systems are growing to match the complexity of the operations that we're doing. So supervisory models, we inherit the one that we walked into in our job, but the question is it the appropriate one given today's situation, today's societal expectations? I know in our college program here, our supervisory model has changed. We've become more supervisory of our field staff. And that's because of societal pressures, looking at Rasmussen's ladder and looking at some of the higher level influences on what we do. I recognize that society's got a say in the things that we're trying to accomplish here. And I'm susceptible to that, but my question now is, how do I do that properly to set up the staff in the field the best we can do, knowing that that creates interactions. So last one here, number 8, critical incident experience. While we talk about operating at peak capacity, we don't want to be there all the time because that's potentially creates exposure. We need to have some experience around those critical incidents and ramp it up to full speed occasionally. guide experiences at the failure level. That's my training to failure story, which, you know, lives elsewhere. Our staff will be better able to recognize failure coming when they know what failure looks like. So that's number one. Number two then is about systems failure. How do we recognize? It makes sense to me as a guide helping that. It's a lot more challenging to say, when is my deck of cards, which is my management structure, going to fall apart? That's where we need to be testing this and going through these checkpoints and looking at how this works. Looking at our organizational structures to see where they may fail, and putting some stress on our systems from time to time is valuable from that perspective. So if we have the guide at the active end, okay, we've got the sense-making perspective, we've got the social level in between unaddressed at this particular hour, our latent conditions and organizational factors. I just ran through a whole handful of them. Organizational factors which all exist within the industrial research and which is emerging in our field and our understanding around those. They can be organized on the right-hand side of our screen as the risk tolerance, the systems errors, and the operating features. So I clicked these out here. I believe I did not click those out. Sorry, I was going to list all 8 of them in one particular place. Risk tolerance alignment, explicit versus the ones you write down versus your implicit versions. Your systems errors, which is your core process, and that's mapping the 7 systems. And then we've got things like coupling. We've got things like supervisory model. We've got things like peak experience, our experience operating at peak capacity. And we've got things like our recognition of failure and when things fall apart. All of those pieces, we checklist each of those. And what you would do is come and grab these slides and you would click back through them and you would take time to think through your operation in each of those pieces to see what are the gaps that are exposed in your own particular operation to do this. So here's your to-do list. I'm drawing towards the end here. So if you have questions, you can send them in. We have our last 10 minutes free for questions here. So to-do list. Number one, this whole story starts at risk tolerance, in my opinion, is to ask, what do we say about our risk and what do we really do about managing risk? And look for alignment between those. And you know what? You ask your staff. And if you have a frank relationship with your staff, a good safety culture, and they can tell you where there's misalignment between here's what you say as a manager and here's what you make me do as a staff, they'll help us understand that, and we can plug those gaps. That probably goes the furthest of everything that we're talking about to get rid of the insidious latent errors that are invisible. Number 2 on your to-do list, map out your core processes. That paper exercise is just so valuable. And you know what, for a new manager, I think this is what part of a training process, if somebody's coming into a logistics role or to a new supervisory role, is say, map out for me, step by step, draw them, connect all the pieces with arrows about how things work in this organization as we bring clients into the system, run them through a program, and send them on their way as a better, more rounder, more valuable person. Write it all down. That opens up the door conversations about what we're doing, and it looks at our systems. So number 3 then, trial run your systems. There's a bunch of ways to do this. Here's a simple way, which is a fast way, and you could do this right after our presentation. Go to your filing box or your database and pull out an incident. If you record your incidents on an incident report form, pull it out, and you start with a what happened. Hopefully the narrative tells you that. You do a substitution test on it. Would this have happened to another student in that situation? If the answer is yes, then you're going to take that incident report and you're going to check against these check marks that we just looked at about things like the social situation, things like the risk tolerance, things like the core process map, things like the systems, things like the peak operating capacity coupling. You get it. All the things we just spent the last time on, and you test that against your incident report. And you say, you know what? In some cases, these things are really robust. In other cases, we're kind of weak in that area. And that's where you target the growth and target improvements. The other perspective, the more labor-intensive perspective out of this, is you flip this around and you say, now let's all sit down together, all of our managers or our senior staff, and let's run through an emergency response simulation to see how our systems are going to work when they're under stress. And that can be paper or it can be real time. It depends how much time and energy you want to put into this, but they are obviously valuable in light of if you've not been tested for real. If you have been tested for real, you know, you've had the misfortune of having a major organizational crisis in the last handful of years, let's say last 2 years, you know what, you could just pull that apart, mine that in this same conversation and see where the gaps are. But if not, you would run a trial for yourself and see where those gaps are going to emerge. Those are all pieces that come out of this. So the bottom line is that this is about fundamentally attaching our operations and our role as managers to systems and trying to put, it's my attempt as a speaker for you here, is trying to make the big systems field very practical on a bullet point list. You know, there's 8 things we talked about at the organizational level, which are the real application of systems, how they actually land in our operations. That's the test that we put against these things and make these things work. So you'll have access to these slides. I provide them to Dan. There's sources that contribute to this conversation that we're having here. And remember, the big names were Reason and Rasmussen. Reason and Rasmussen are the 2 big players in the academic field here. So beyond that, I want to open up the floor for questions. We have what's potentially 6 minutes until the top of the hour. So I would be happy to entertain questions about how to apply these ideas or to pull apart any one of these specific ideas. Feel free to ask those kind of as you go along. Or potentially you could provide some commentary on this. We don't have a lot of folks listening in, so there is room for you to actually provide some commentary, and we can address any of those kinds of ideas and perspectives on those at the same time. So please jump on your keyboards and offer any of those kinds of questions or insight. Where would you go next out of this? This is an organization view, and if we look at the Rasmussen's ladder, there is a bigger movement towards looking at the whole system. And like I said, this is coming out of Australia, an outdoor educator by the name of Claire Dallett, D-A-L-L-E-T. She does great work on talking about this whole system. And she's kind of been the cheerleader for the socio-technical systems. That's what they're called, because it's got a social aspect to it, society, and it's got a technical aspect to it. My own personal stake and my own talk today has been very specific about the organization, just trying to pull out one layer here. Recognizing that when things go wrong, it's a lot of little pieces contribute to it, things going wrong. It's not as simple as just saying the guide made a mistake. We have to be more sophisticated and ask ourselves, what did we do to contribute? What did we as an organization, what did I do as a manager do to contribute to this situation so that I can prevent more robust systems and deter these things from happening in the future. So Dan asked you a question. How do you see the systems approach changing some of our norms in outdoor education? For example, will incident reports need to look different in the future based on this? Our incident reports are certainly organized at the discrete autonomous event model. For a long time in my own incident report, there was a little checkbox in there which had cause of incident, and it said, you know, slip on ice, slip in rocks, blah, blah, blah. I took that away because it's not that simple. And quite frankly, from my own understanding, that instructors were probably misinterpreting situations and simplifying situations. One of the movements in safety culture is to not simplify a situation and call it, oh, the person just slipped. Is to always ask bigger questions about what implications might there be. So a question for you to take home or potentially to share with us here is, how does this change the norms in our outdoor education field whenever we look at a greater, leaving just the instructor's role and looking at a greater system, our operation, our organization, and the bodies we're attached to, and the government and the role that they play. Certainly in my jurisdiction here, as we go up the ladder and we leave the organization, gain the government level in Canada, there's not a lot of oversight of the adventure field and the outdoor education field. It becomes pretty light. Different jurisdictions see different levels there, and therefore there's going to be different influences on the operations themselves. So I'm curious and open to hear any of your questions or any of your commentary, what you might have pulling in here. We still have a couple minutes before we run out of time, so I'm happy to hear that too. Let's see, continuing on our next steps. As managers, we've got this role where we one of our primary roles is training our staff. I think the next question is, where do we go to get training for ourselves? And clearly the AEE is offering an avenue to do this, but attaching ourselves to the greater research fields that are out there, the greater industrial safety fields that are out there, and my reference list captures a bunch of these, which are places to go to find the next steps and find what else is going. Google Scholar is a remarkable resource for us all. We can go and see what's living out there. And our outdoor specific journals, academic journals, are where much of our own interpretations of this is landing and going to end up. So as we become, we're just kind of leaving our adolescence, quite frankly, I believe, as far as organizing ourselves and talking about a systems approach and having more robust management structures in place, leaving the field and thinking bigger picture. And we're going to see a bunch of progress on this in the near future because of the developments in just the last 5 years talking about systems and the impact they're going to have on the things that we're doing. Interested, like I said, feel free to contribute any questions or comments. We still have a bit of time if you choose, another couple minutes.
Yep, just while folks are deciding whether they're going to be shy on the keyboard or not. I really want to first just thank you for sort of bringing this to the table. It does seem that this is the future. It's nice to see outdoor education kind of opening the box and not trying to say that we're just this special kind of risk management and we don't need to pay attention to how other people are doing it. It's definitely cutting edge stuff, and it's good to see us opening the doors. One thing that came up for me when you were talking about kind of peak capacity is places I've worked, we've done a lot of, simulations, emergency scenarios, but we always do them in a way where we are resource heavy at that moment because it's a training and because nothing else is going on and there happens to be 30 people in the room. And so as somebody managing that scenario, you have so much to choose from in how to manage that. But it makes me think perhaps we should pretend to be doing that scenario in the middle of June and limit the amount of resources that staff has. Is that something you've seen some do or would suggest?
Yeah, very good. And good training is so expensive. And then there's an example of expensive training. So either keeping the groups very small, which is an expensive thing to do, very one-on-one type professional development, one-on-one type training, or small group training, more expensive, but it's all much more valuable. The more personalized and more personally meaningful we can create, the more valuable it's going to be. The training, that's a great point, how training is often resource rich. We're taking that time out to do it. The more realistic, and that's my whole gig about training to failure, right? Make it real so the feedback is real and the emotions are real and we place ourselves there. That's the requirement to do it properly. Doing it right is more cumbersome and more labor intensive, but it's got the better outcomes in the end.
But I see a question coming from Andrew. We'll go a little longer and see if we can address that.
So how much of this do you think is shared with your leaders? Mine are all, almost exclusively beginner leaders. And where does our complexity interfere with their ability to do a good job? How much of this do you share with your leaders? Probably not a lot. I think the social, so on the screen right now with the pyramid, I think the social aspect needs to be discussed with our staff. But the latent conditions, the organizational factors, probably not a lot. This is on our desk, and this is the things that we should be thinking about, and a little bit less for them. There's complexity in every organization. Your question about where does complexity interfere with their ability to do a good job, the complexity needs to match the operations that we're running. And as our operations get bigger or go into more challenging clientele, we need to match that. Our systems need to become more robust to cover the new exposure that goes with that. I don't think it's our job to pollute our staff's understanding of the world necessarily with this. They need to know the emergency response plan and the realities about resource limitations. When they open up their cell phone or their satellite phone and they call for the cavalry, they have to know what's going to be coming and what the realities are around that. My experience doing wilderness programs in Northern Canada, like we were many, many hours away from offering any help at all. And that was an important piece. That's within an emergency response plan training. As a manager then of that same organization, I was juggling much more complexity than the staff needed to understand. So I think there's a filter here that this is our problem in a lot of cases. Nor do we want to necessarily make it so easy for our staff to just say, oh yeah, well, there's a problem with the system, so it's not my fault. We need our staff still to perform at the highest level that they can perform, giving them what they need to work with. But in the background, our systems are robust to set them up for success and not have ambiguity, not have gaps, not be able to offer them the support that they need to get out the door and run the trips they do. This is our problem. This is a management story. Andrew liked that answer. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for listening in today.
So folks do have your contact information if they come up with questions later and want to get in touch with you. And like you said, I'll make these slides available in the follow-up email that'll be sent out shortly.
Very good.
Once again, really want to thank you, Jeff, for keeping us on the cutting edge of risk management and training and outdoor education. Really appreciate your approach to these presentations. I get more content, more usable, actionable content than I ever imagined I could get in an hour. And I really appreciate that.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Thanks to everyone who listened in today. And I'm happy to entertain questions via email or a phone call. That's totally cool.